Okay, so the session today, what we're going to be covering, quite a wide range of issues. Our first presentation is going to be by Ben Smith, who's the Prevent coordinator. Then we're going to be looking at learning from reviews and a number of issues that have come up in safeguarding children's safeguarding practice reviews, safeguarding adult reviews, and domestic homicide reviews. So we're going to just give you an update on some of those issues and the guidance. And then we'll be having a break, and then we have two more presentations. One is about trauma-informed practice, and finally the dynamic support pathway. So please stick around. I think it's going to be really great. We've had a question, will you be sending the slides over later? If we get your email and you fill out the registration form, yes. So moving on, I always put this slide up. This is obviously the third session that we've done, and I put this up really for the people that haven't been on this before, just to give you an outline, a very brief outline of the role of the Safeguarding Children's Partnerships and Safeguarding Adults Board across Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland. So this is, when we talk about partnership, we're talking about statutory agencies, we're talking about with the independent and the voluntary sector. And those people are part of the, if you like, the strategic leadership are part of the safeguarding partnership boards. And, you know, it is about, if you like, coordinating that effective working relationship to safeguard both children and adults. And how we do this is through reviews. I've mentioned safeguarding practice reviews, safeguarding adult reviews, and domestic homicide reviews, and they are all, you know, they are all mandatory reviews that are supported by guidance from the Department of Education and the Home Office, and working together for safeguarding children, the Children Act, the Care Act, so they're all underpinned by legislation and guidance. Agency audits on particular issues. We develop procedures and guidance. We offer training and tools to support practice. And I do urge you to get onto our websites to look at what's on there in terms of giving you more information on the world of safeguarding adults and children. And then we're involved in engagement with people who use our services. We try to get the messages out there to the public about what is child safeguarding and adult safeguarding. So we have that communication strategy. And on this link, we've got the on this slide, we've got the link to our websites. Whoops. Okay. I seem to have transcript on as well. It's interesting. And yeah, the other thing to mention is Safeguarding Matters, which is our publication that comes out quarterly, and it covers all the issues that are around for us locally and nationally. And there's a link there to where you can find all the copies of previous copies of Safeguarding Matters. From time to time, we do a special edition. and we have recently done a special edition on safeguarding and adults with learning disabilities. So please have a look at that.
Well, thank you. Morning, everyone. No, thank you, Helen, and the team for inviting my role to present today. Really good opportunity, especially as Helen's mentioned, 258 attendees. So this is a really good opportunity just to sort of raise awareness of what Prevent is doing at the moment. We can talk a bit about sort of strategy and things like that. So good to be involved. So just quickly, in terms of expectations for the session, I think I'm on till about 10:15. I'll briefly sort of run through my role, what the sort of the role and the duties are really of the Prevent coordinator for Leicester and Leicestershire. I'll then go a bit into sort of national risk around sort of counter-terrorism and just sort of talk about some of the risks. We'll then go a bit local. We'll just sort of make that a bit Leicester specific. So I'll just talk very briefly about a couple of sort of recent cases and incidents within Leicester City. And then I'll talk about some sort of policy and procedures, and we'll go through some of those elements, and then sort of finishing up really with reporting and referral pathways, which I think again is really important just to re-emphasise. So they will be sort of the main sections of the sort of the presentation over the next sort of 30-35 minutes or so. Next slide, please. Super, thank you. So just quickly about my role, Leicester Prevent Coordinator, really interesting sort of setup that we have for Leicester and Leicestershire, in that my role is based within the St Philip's Centre, which is an interfaith charity based in Evington in Leicester City. Anywhere else in the country, if I was a Leicester Prevent Coordinator, I'd be based within the local authority, but we have a really interesting and novel kind of partnership arrangement and setup in Leicester. So I sit within the St Philip's Centre, but work incredibly closely with Leicester City Council, also Leicestershire County Council and the districts and boroughs as well. I still consider myself to be relatively new within the role. I started in July last year, but there's a lot to learn within the role. I'm still learning on a day-by-day basis. But yeah, I was taken up full time at the St Philip's Centre back in July last year. And in essence, the Prevent coordinator role is really a partnership manager role. It's here to kind of ensure that we, across the city and county, deliver the Prevent statutory duty. So that was a legal duty that was enshrined in 2015. And that applies to sort of public sector agencies. As I've said, the role is hosted by the St Philip's Centre. And I think what's really important to emphasise, and I suppose the reason my role exists in Leicester, is that Leicester is graded as what we call a Prevent priority area. That brings with it a whole host of advantages. The main one being we see a real uplift in Home Office funding. So Home Office funding supports my role. We also have a series of other roles based across the city and county. We're currently looking to recruit, as you can see there, a Prevent Support Officer role. So adverts will be going out fairly soon for that. So that's a role to kind of assist my role directly. That will be based within the St Philip's Centre. We've also, probably for about 5, if not 6 years now, had a Prevent Education Officer role, the PEO. That's a role I work really closely with. The officer for Leicester City and the county is Elsa Cool, who some of you may know, may have worked with previously, but she's based within Leicester City Council's community safety team, and her primary function is to deliver the Prevent statutory duty across kind of the primary school and the secondary school sectors, so completely sort of within the education sector. Also, just to quickly mention, with that extra Home Office funding, not only does it support the roles that I've mentioned, but we do also have significant community delivery as well of Prevent. So within the 2022-23 financial year, we had 12 community projects that were funded to deliver Prevent activities across Leicester and Leicestershire communities, across kind of a range of neighbourhoods, range of communities, a real range of sort of community sector organisations. And again, I'm sure many will be familiar with some of those organisations. So, for example, Somali Development Service delivered a project, Sharma Women's Centre, Young Leicestershire, Leicester City in the community down with the football club. They also had one of our projects. So as you can see, we have a range of sort of community partners, which I think, again, in terms of increasing confidence and community kind of involvement with Prevent is really crucial. I could probably do a whole presentation just about our community delivery, but I won't. So we can talk about that if anyone needs to on a later date. But next slide, please. Thank you. So just not to start with a complete negative, but just to frame, I suppose, where we are, sadly, in terms of our terrorism risk currently in the UK, and just to think about some of the more recent events and some of the ideologies behind it. The picture here, there will be 4 pictures in total for this slide, but just to really raise awareness of what the risk currently looks like. This is very sadly an incident from last year. Some of you may be aware of. This was an attack upon an asylum processing centre in Kent. It was in Manston, from memory. This was deemed to be a sort of an attack. It was graded as a terrorist attack. There was a far right kind of ideology behind it. It was by a chap called Andrew Leake, who very sadly went on to kill himself in that vehicle after the attack as well. But a very recent kind of attack. But I think also just being aware really of kind of some of the far right ideology and how that can be a potential threat towards some of our sort of asylum and immigration services. So that's certainly something that's on the horizon at the moment. Next slide there, next picture is very sadly, that was Sir David Amess, the MP, who was the MP for Southend. He, as some of you may be aware, he was tragically killed whilst conducting an MP's surgery in his constituency. That attack was politically motivated and was deemed to be a terrorist attack. So, you know, really tragic incident there. But yeah, like I said, it was graded as a terrorist incident. Next picture, please. This incident was from late 2021. This was the attack upon the Women's Hospital in Liverpool. Again, some of you will be very familiar with this scene in the picture. It was obviously widespread on the news at the time. There was initial kind of uncertainty about that incident, but upon kind of investigation, that was also deemed to be a terrorist incident. I think a really interesting kind of case study in itself. It seemed like the attacker was very motivated by kind of attacks within Afghanistan, for example, against sort of women's universities and also schools. There have been similar attacks undertaken in Afghanistan. So I think there is a potential link there in terms of how the ideology was influenced. So again, an incident where the full force of the planned attack thankfully didn't actually happen. The bomb itself didn't go off, but the actual there was a detonation of the trigger device, and that caused the fire in the taxi, which you can see there. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is just a stat. This is from actually sort of late 2021, but just to mention really that, again, this from the security services point of view, which sits outside of Prevent, ongoing kind of investigations, kind of operations that are looking at sort of foiling terror plots. And at that point in time, in terms of a snapshot, September 2021, MI5 at that point had foiled 31 very late stage terror plots. So again, sadly shows that the risk and the potential harm that the UK continues to face from terrorism. Next slide, please. Thank you. So moving from the national and just bringing it to the Leicester context, this is a slide just taken really from the Leicester Mercury. This is sort of public information, but again, I think shows sadly how certain ideologies have involved people from Leicester. So this is in relation to a prescribed extreme far right organisation called National Action, who are a neo-Nazi group, and we had a Leicester resident called Daniel Bogunovich, who was sentenced and charged with being a member of National Action. Really an interesting kind of case study to understand how Daniel became radicalized and became involved with such a hateful organisation as National Action, as well as kind of the national network of National Action sort of activists as well. But I think we just need to be mindful. This sadly was someone from within a Leicester neighbourhood who became sort of self-radicalised, became involved with with a group like National Action, and currently is in prison for being part of a group that is now deemed.
You've put yourself on mute, Ben.
Oh, I should be off now, hopefully. Yeah. We're not just talking far right here, but we're talking about extreme sort of far right terrorism. So really serious organisations. Next slide, please. And just so you're aware, just that was just, yeah, the logo for National Action that just popped up. So thank you. Yeah, next slide. Also then, just to maybe from the other side of the spectrum, so moving from the extreme right wing to maybe more of your kind of your Islamic State or Al-Qaeda inspired extremism. This is just a case study. Again, this is open source material, so this was a slide I was able to put together based from information on the BBC. There was an arrest in 28th of March last year in Highfields. And this was for an 18-year-old man for terrorist offences. There was subsequently a trial at the end of last year, and he was found guilty of sort of sharing information and looking at potential kind of attack planning on the sort of the Al-Qaeda Islamic State sort of side of terrorism and extremism. And I think really what's troubling here, I suppose, is the young age of the offender. It's only an 18-year-old lad who was in local college, and it's really sad now that he will be spending time within prison for the terrorism offences. So sadly, someone that's been affected by this for life. Next slide. So, moving from the local and the national, what I would just want to briefly then talk about in terms of policy and strategy is very quickly talk about where we sit currently. So the word contest, you'll see hopefully at the top there, contest is the name of the UK government's current counter-terrorism strategy. So we as part of Prevent sort of feed into contest, and contest is broken down into 4 sort of core elements, which we call the 4 Ps. So what I'll do very quickly here is just sort of move through the 4 Ps just to really showcase what they do. So as we can see there, just the 4th P with prevent. So we have protect, prepare, pursue and prevent. And I think the reason for showing this is just to show again and be clear about the different elements of the counter-terrorism strategy and where I sit, I suppose, as a prevent coordinator. So if we start with protect, there'll be a number of clicks here. So next click, please. So protect is very much around sort of infrastructures. It's about protecting buildings. Many of you will have heard about the protect duty in the news recently. So ongoing now for a year or two has been the Manchester Arena inquiry, which obviously relates to the Manchester Arena bombing from 2017. And one of the main elements that the Manchester Arena inquiry is looking at is the potential for what we call the protect duty. But this is looking at really how buildings, how large scale public events can essentially safeguard themselves and think about how they can protect themselves from a potential terrorist attack. So that's very much about buildings. It's about sort of physical infrastructure. Next click, please. So then we move into next click. We'll move into prepare. Prepare is essentially your sort of emergency planning function of the counter-terrorism strategy. So that's sadly where, if an attack is imminent, it's about the emergency plan that will be enacted to mitigate the kind of impact of that particular terrorism incident. So that's very much about logistics. And again, like it says there, reducing any potential impact of an attack. Next click, please. Next click. Pursue, then the 3rd P, as you can see there from the picture. Pursue is around kind of disrupting and actually stopping terrorist attacks. I think what's really interesting to mention with pursue is often the conflation that people may have between pursue and prevent. Sometimes people might have a view that prevent is about surveillance and it's about spying. That's absolutely what I am not able to do as a prevent coordinator, and it's not what the prevent program does, but that is potentially what the pursue element of the contest strategy is doing. So that is around surveillance, and it is around kind of stopping and foiling potential plots. So a really important part of the counter-terrorism strategy, but that's very much led by sort of security services, MI5, etc. So very much in that realm. Next click, please. And as you can see there, the types of sort of operations that would be undertaken by Pursue would actually be raids and things like that, that again, Prevent and my role would not be getting involved with. Next click, please. And then finally, then we move into Prevent. And Prevent really is very much around, the key focus is about people. So we are looking at working with people who may be vulnerable to being drawn into terrorism, maybe drawn into extremism and potentially radicalized, but it's very much looking at people that may be vulnerable or susceptible to extremism and then potentially radicalization. Next clip, please. So, like, yeah, very much about the individual. Now, where does that fit in, I suppose, with today's session? The core aim of Prevent, and maybe again where it differs to the other sort of 3 Ps within the counter-terrorism strategy, Prevent is absolutely about safeguarding. So it's a safeguarding process. Like I've said, it's around kind of safeguarding individuals who may be vulnerable or susceptible. And within Prevent as a safeguarding measure, we have sort of 3 sort of broadly kind of core elements, which I'll just briefly go through here. So in terms of that triangle, we have, I suppose, the rehabilitation side. Just very quickly, if we're talking about the rehabilitation, that tends to be the space within, for example, the prisons and probation service. So that might be people that have been potentially connected to terrorism. They might have even gone through the pursue space. They might have served a sentence, but while they're in prison, they would then be looking to be sort of rehabilitated. And as part of that, they might be part of what's called the Desistance and Disengagement Programme, which is the national de-radicalisation programme in the prison space. So I, within my Prevent role, have some kind of some links with the rehabilitation side, but predominantly that element of Prevent is being led by prisons and probation. The middle section there around early intervention is there where my role as a Prevent coordinator gets more involved, and this is where again I will keep re-emphasising kind of the safeguarding element of Prevent as a strategy. So we absolutely kind of abide and deliver Prevent within kind of core safeguarding principles. We have, as part of that, something called the Channel Panel, which I'll go into a bit more detail in a moment. And as part of our safeguarding offer, we have sort of tailored multi-agency support available to people that are referred in to Prevent. Also then, as part of our sort of Prevent offer and as part of the Prevent strategy, we look to tackle causes of radicalisation. And essentially, this is where some of our community delivery comes in. So where I mentioned our funded community projects, they have a really important role here to play, looking at empowering communities, sort of raising awareness of what Prevent is, equally kind of raising awareness of what Prevent isn't and being clear about that. We look at sort of online as well as offline risks of extremism within Leicestershire, but also kind of more widely, I suppose, the international online space and how that might potentially radicalise local people. We obviously clearly look to tackle causes or potential risks of radicalisation within education. So like I mentioned earlier on, we have Elsa, who's our Prevent Education Officer, our PEO, and she'll be delivering within the education sector. I should also mention that we also have covering Leicester, but as well as the East Midlands, we have a Department for Education regional Prevent coordinator as well. That's a chap called Sam Slack, who's been in the role for many years now, covering Leicester and Leicestershire within his role. But he works within kind of higher education and also sort of further education, so predominantly sort of the college and the university sector. And then we also look at sort of civic engagement. We look at citizenship. So again, it's about involving local people as much as possible within Prevent, and wherever possible, I suppose, emphasising what the referral pathways are for Prevent, and also, I suppose, looking at providing people with opportunities to work through sort of case studies, for example, and understand how the Prevent process works. Next slide, please. So I mentioned in the previous slide channel and the channel panel. So I just want to delve into that in a little bit more detail. And again, we could actually run probably a whole day session, if I'm honest, on the work of channel. But as it says there, channel is a key part of the National Prevent statutory duty. And I think for us within Prevent, it really is, it forms the absolute sort of nuts and bolts of Prevent. It really is, it's this kind of the core, the solid rock really within the Prevent programme. It's an expectation and it's an absolutely a requirement for every local authority area across the country, whether they're a Prevent priority area or a non-funded priority area. Every local authority has to have what's called a channel panel. And in essence, the channel panel is it's a safeguarding panel. So I'm sure some of you on the meeting today will be or will have attended possibly safeguarding panels. Channel works in a very, very similar way, if not, you know, an identical way to other safeguarding panels that we have across different range of safeguarding sort of, you know, areas across LLR. But the key thing, I suppose, that identifies, you know, the work of the channel, it's looking at identifying those individuals of risk at being drawn into terrorism. So people are referred into channel. The channel panel is completely sort of multi-agency, and again in a minute I'll just run through some of the sort of the core agencies and sectors that we have on channel, but it's up to that safeguarding group to obviously assess the nature and look at the risk of the individuals that are referred into the channel panel. And then where the really strong kind of offer from the channel panel exists is around, we as a panel, and again my role sits on channel, we look at developing the most appropriate support plans for the individuals or families or potentially even groups that are referred into our channel panel. And that's where, again, there's a very strong offer there. We have a range of what are called IPs available to us. So the IPs are what are called intervention providers. We have a national network of approximately 90 IPs that are Home Office registered. In essence, they're mentors. So they cover a range of different sort of ideologies, and where we have channel casework, what we try to do with it as a panel is align that vulnerable person with one of our IPs, and then over a period, potentially months, sometimes even longer than months, I mean cases can go on for over a year, we will use that IP as a mentor for that individual, and we will look at kind of de-radicalization and hopefully moving that person towards a more positive space, and hopefully where they can move away from potentially the damaging sort of ideology that they previously held. The final bit there on that slide, again, is really important for us to emphasize, but channel is a completely voluntary program. So we have to gain consent from anyone who's referred into the channel panel. If it's an adult, then obviously we will go directly to that person and require the signed consent. If someone is under 18, if it's a child, for example, then obviously we would go through the parent or guardian to gain that consent. Once someone is proposed to being on the channel panel and the channel panel collectively adopts that person, we have about 90 days to gain consent. If we can't gain consent from the person, then at that point they are no longer part of the channel panel. I think the voluntary essence of channel is really, again, really important to emphasize. We have no levers to force people to be part of this process. And I know some critics of Prevent would say, well, it doesn't really make sense. If someone's got a harmful attitude and potentially they are a terrorism concern, my gosh, surely it should be a compulsory process. I think the strength, though, of it being voluntary is that we are able to, in essence, work in a desecuritized place. So we're not, as part of channel, we have no sort of powers of arrest or anything like that. Channel doesn't criminalize people, which I think again is really important. And again, I think some of the pushback that we often have to provide with Prevent is that it's not, it's not a criminal space. It's a safeguarding space that in essence is there purely to help the individual and actually kind of improve hopefully their life chances. So again, channel being voluntary is really, really important. Next slide, please. And just briefly here, just to kind of emphasize just some of a snapshot really of just some of the core agencies that we have around channel. You can see there, so it's a range of agencies. We have, as well as the statutory kind of agencies who sit on channel every single month, and I should say channel meets on a monthly basis. We also have the ability, or the chair has the ability, to obviously call in on a case-by-case basis different agencies. So for example, if we had a young person, let's just say a school student from a secondary school, if so required, we could obviously invite the head teacher or maybe even the school teacher directly for that pupil to come in and then be part of the channel panel, and they could kind of assist with the case management. But again, that's the ability of the chair to sort of make those requests and ask for extra agencies, or it could well be a social worker obviously who's working very closely with that case, and naturally it would benefit the channel panel to have that social worker attending the monthly meetings. And like I've said, reaffirming it, but channel exists in the non-criminal space as you can see. So we are about essentially just assisting individuals, working with them to hopefully bring down the risk that they may have in terms of vulnerabilities. But again, the overarching ethos of channel and the Prevent program is very much safeguarding. Next slide, please. Might just require a couple of clicks here as well, please. One more, maybe two more clicks. And one more. Thank you very much. Thank you. So if I just quickly go into, we're now moving a bit away from sort of the policy side of things, and I just want to focus very quickly on just some of the core sort of ideologies that we see in Prevent currently. And again, I could do a day session, and I have day sessions, training packages available to go into these in much more detail. So this is very much just light touch, but just for now, sort of showcasing where we have our sort of core risk. So the first, and this is no particular order by any means, but the first kind of risk area I just want to touch on here is the extreme right-wing terrorism. And we have here just a couple of pictures of UK residents who have been arrested and sentenced over the past couple of years for terrorism-based offences linked to extreme right-wing terrorism. And again, you can see right in the middle here the logo for the organisation National Action, which again I just want to sort of re-emphasise. So the top left is a chap called Darren Osborne. There's actually the anniversary of his terrorist attack, but he attacked the Finsbury Park Mosque a number of years ago. And attacked Muslim worshippers outside the mosque. The chap on the top right is Thomas Mayer, who very sadly killed Joe Cox, the MP. And then the bottom left is a chap who was part of the National Action Group. He was arrested last year following quite a lengthy court case, and he was one of the sort of the key instigators of that organisation. I think what's really concerning with the extreme right-wing terrorism threat at the moment is it's definitely kind of a growing threat in terms of the referrals that we see to Prevent, not just nationally, but we certainly see that locally across Leicester and Leicestershire. And I think also just worth mentioning the ever decreasing age of referrals that we're seeing. So certainly over the past 2 years, certainly since lockdown, the pandemic year, our extreme right-wing terrorism referrals by age are coming down very much into the sort of the mid, in many cases the mid teenagers, sort of 14-15-year-olds. That's quite a change really over the past couple of years, and it definitely seems to be involving younger people, and again predominantly in the online space as well. Next slide, please. And just one more click, please. Our next category is a bit of a curious one, but I do want to mention it. It's called MOU, M-U-U, and that stands for Mixed, Unclear and Unstable Ideologies. So MOU was a category that was created probably about 3 years ago, and over the past 3 years it's grown in size. So there's a bit of work at the moment where nationally we're going to break it down so we actually don't have such a large kind of catch-all category. But very briefly, MOU covers things like school shooting obsessions. It also covers things like the incel movement. So incel stands for involuntary celibate, and we've seen violent incidents such as here include the example from Plymouth down in Devon from the end of, or I think it was summer 2021, where sadly 5 people were shot and killed in Plymouth, and that was linked partly due to the incel movement. So MOU is really interesting, but like I said, it encompasses quite a range of different ideologies and sometimes cross-cutting ideologies. So hence we have the word unstable in there as well. But there is some work going on at the moment just to kind of break the MOU category down a little bit, so it's a bit more distinct, and we have more sort of distinct categories. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, just two more clicks, and final click. Thank you. And then the final ideology that I just want to reference is the Al Qaeda or Daesh or ISIS inspired terrorism. And again, we've just included a couple of pictures there of some of the threats and risks. Sadly, incidents on London Bridge. This remains again a kind of a core kind of ideology of concern for Prevent. We continue to see kind of referrals and cases within Channel linked to Al Qaeda and Daesh. I think the threat picture has changed over the past couple of years. So whereas before, maybe going back to sort of 2014, 2015, when the threat was more around, for example, people leaving the UK to go and fight with Daesh in Syria, that threat doesn't exist in the same way now. We're in a different time period, but there remains kind of just an ongoing, sort of threat and risk there as well. So we probably have around sort of 20% of our referrals in Leicester and Leicestershire linked to Al Qaeda and ISIS inspired terrorism. Next slide, please. And just to mention this was another case study. So again, this is open source material, as well as the previous 3 ideology categories that I've discussed. I just want to also reference kind of the concern that we've seen over the past 2 or 3 years, I suppose, since the pandemic, around kind of conspiracy theories. And this was a local case, some of you may be aware of, many may not, but this was a chap called Oliver Lewin, who was actually based up in Colville, up in northwest Leicestershire. He was a telecommunications engineer, but he, together with others, was actually planning a whole series of terrorist attacks across kind of UK communications infrastructure. And he was, at the beginning of this year, actually back in January, was found guilty, and he's now serving quite a lengthy sentence for terrorism offences. But I think worth mentioning, just because it does show, unfortunately, the direct sort of terrorism linked to conspiracy theories. Again, many of you will be aware of things that emerged during the pandemic, such as the QAnon conspiracy. There's a whole range of other conspiracy theories, but this just provides one sort of case study, really, where very sadly for Oliver, he went down a complete sort of rabbit hole, became completely obsessed by that conspiracy, so much so that he was actually planning to undertake terrorist incidents across Leicestershire and potentially wider across the UK. So he was in a very very dark place. Next slide, please. And I'm just going to quickly, mindful of time, I've got I think a minute or 2 left. I just want to highlight really some of the vulnerabilities and potential warning signs and things you may want to consider working with clients and working with service users within your own agencies. So this just includes a list of potential vulnerabilities, but what I'm really keen to point out here, there's no single pathway to radicalization. This isn't like a tick list of things that absolutely means that if you tick 5 of these, for example, you will be a terrorist. That is absolutely what we're not saying. But what we are saying is just these are potential vulnerabilities to be mindful of. And again, if you have questions about individuals that might be displaying some of these vulnerabilities, that's again where we would encourage a potential call to myself or our Prevent Police colleagues as well, where we would welcome just a conversation about any concerns that you may have for individuals. But this just comes up with and highlights just some of the potential vulnerabilities that we see. And again, within our cases within the channel panel, often more often than not, we would see some of these vulnerabilities present as well within the cases. Next slide, please. And then also just to consider the potential warning signs. So if we're thinking about the vulnerabilities previously, it might exhibit itself in behaviour. And these are some of the warning signs that we might see. Again, being absolutely clear about this is not an absolute tick list. So if someone shows 7 or 8 of these, it doesn't absolutely mean they are going to be a terrorist. I need to be absolutely clear with that. Every case is absolutely unique. And again, that's one of the challenges we face with our work. And equally, this isn't the complete and exhaustive list of all the warning signs that we will see. This is just some. Clearly, though, with this list, as you move towards maybe the final sort of 3 or 4 bullet points there on the right hand side, when we're talking about sympathy for extreme groups, joining extreme organisations, clearly that would be a really concerning, potentially very high risk kind of warning sign. But regardless, these are some of the warning signs that we just want people and sort of agencies and service providers to be mindful of. Next slide, please. And the final slide. This is the referral process. So if you take one thing away from my presentation today, it will be how to report. How do you report prevent concerns? So again, we are a form of safeguarding, being absolutely clear about that. And the key thing to think about, really, the 3 points process to think about is notice, check, share. So if you notice any kind of vulnerabilities or the warning signs that I've just talked about, pick up on that, be vigilant about it, think about it. If you feel really deeply uncomfortable about what you're hearing or what your mind's telling you about a particular individual, then check it and check that with maybe a manager or your designated safeguarding lead if you have one. If they have the same concerns with you, then it's the time at that point to then share the concern. And what we'd be asking for is you to make that prevent referral through to us. So I've just included there the police prevent email address. So that's for Leicestershire Police's prevent team. And equally, we have the direct link there through to the prevent referral form, which is hosted on the Leicestershire Police website. And again, I want to be absolutely clear, referring to someone to prevent, we are a safeguarding process. So you're not criminalising anyone by doing this. by you know, again, we in Prevent very much want to work with individuals within that non-criminal space. We want to prevent them from going into the criminal space. So just by having those kind of conversations with the police Prevent team, or even making the referral, you know, we're absolutely making sure we're not looking to criminalize people. So I think that's just really important to mention. Next click, please. I think I'm nearly there now. So again, if you have a concerned individual, escalate, another click. Discuss with your line manager, discuss with your DSL. If they have the same concerns, then absolutely make a referral to Prevent. And again, I'm more than happy to have any sort of conversations. My role is here to have those types of conversations, but it just so happens that the Prevent referral process actually goes through Leicestershire Police, which is the same structure as everywhere else in the country. No, next slide, please. And there you have them. Yeah, just so you have them. There's my email address. As well as my work mobile phone number. So I'm really happy for everyone on the call to have those details. Any queries, any sort of follow-up work that you may have, then by all means get in touch. Like I said, as part of my role, we have a whole range of other Prevent training packages. So if your organisation wants some further sort of training or input on Prevent, then I'm more than happy to have a discussion with you, and we can do that. So I'll leave it there. I think I've just probably overrun slightly, but tried to keep to time. So Helen, I'll hand back to you. Hope that's okay.
Thank you. That's great. Sorry, we're seeing something rather random on the screen, but yeah, thanks for that, Ben. That was yeah, really interesting. Liz, is there anything that we want to pick up from the chat at all?
Yes, there's two questions. One is around self-radicalisation. Sorry, because people are popping stuff in the chat. It's moving. I do apologise. Which asks, you use the phrase self-radicalisation when talking about one case. What's the difference between radicalisation and self-radicalisation? How targeted and manipulated are those becoming radicalised, or is it seen as individualised?
Really good question. I'll be really brief on this. We're getting wary of time. So self-radicalised is where someone may be consuming material and actually they just go further and further into more extreme content, so much so that they actually do then cross that threshold and they become radicalised. So if I just very quickly, we've had a case within the East Midlands within the past 6 months where a 19-year-old chap from Glossop up in Derbyshire was consuming more and more extreme materials, and in that sense there was no one actually directly contacting him looking to radicalize him. He was just consuming materials online and actually became self-radicalized, so much so that he then started creating extreme materials himself, and that very sadly actually influenced people in America to actually undertake a terrorist incident in the US. So they were very self-radicalized. Radicalization otherwise, I suppose, or would be, or it could be someone being directly contacted by an extremist. So again, when we're talking about what Daesh and Islamic State were doing maybe around 2014, 2015, they were actively looking to recruit people in the UK to then go and fight over in Syria. So it wasn't the self-radicalization there, it was very much about an extremist group looking to recruit people. I hope that makes it a bit more clear.
And then there's, thank you for that, Ben. There's another question. Does education include alternative provisions in mainstream schools?
It does, yeah. So Ailsa's role as a PEO, Prevent Education Officer, absolutely works across kind of primary and secondary schools, but she does also have capacity and she does look to work across other sort of education sectors. So if requested, I mean, she will you know, go and speak to youth groups and other sectors. So if there is anyone interested from the broad kind of education sector that would, you know, wish to be in contact with Ailsa, we can do that. I know about 10 days ago, Ailsa delivered an input to the LLR Independent Schools Forum and provided like a Prevent input there as well. So again, she's more than happy to you know, assist and work with people across the sector. Hope that's okay.
Yeah, and then there's just one last question that's popped in around Rutland. So you've only mentioned Leicester City and Leicestershire. Is it an LLR offer?
Good question, and apologies from those from Rutland. Absolutely, yeah, it's the LLR coverage that we have. So just in terms of governance, we have the LLR Prevent Steering Group. So that's chaired by a director at Leicester City Council, but it is a complete kind of LLR function, and Rutland is very much part of that. Hugh Crouch, who's the Community Safety Manager at Rutland County Council, he's part of our steering group and very much involved as well. So pleased, yeah, that we're connected with Rutland as well.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Just very quickly before you go, you mentioned training. How do people find out about training?
It might be if people could maybe contact me directly via my details. We are at the moment, part of my role, I'm just in the process of putting together an LLR prevent training plan. So we will be looking at kind of somehow circulating information on and some of the training offer for that plan. But I think right now it's more about if direct inquiries just come into myself, and then we can look at what we could provide. That might be best in the short term, if that's okay. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Griff Jones. I'm the head of service from Leicestershire, and I've recently taken over the chair of the adult audits group. We carry out regular audits, multi-agency audits through the year, and the last audit that we carried out in April focused on how we were working to the thresholds. Now, just at the offset to say that in adults, we are having some discussions around the use of the word thresholds, and I think we may be looking to move those into sort of the idea of calling them decision-making tools, but basically the principle will still remain the same. So we were looking at those, and one of the learning that came out from that was around question 2. So one of the questions we wanted to ask, very much part of making safeguarding personal, was how, at the point of view of a referral coming in, how were we looking at to understand the views of the person at that stage of the process when we were looking at it, because obviously that's key in terms of how we then progress work going forward. And generally what the finding of the audit is that the decision making at this point was consistent to what we would want it to be. Staff valued the tools that were in place and are in place at the moment to help them to do that. But one case did highlight the idea that actually sometimes there's been quite a delay in terms of when the referral comes in, when we consider that referral and understanding the person's views and wishes in relation to the issues that have been raised. And some of that has been about the fact that the adult social care worker has been unable to talk to the person at the time to understand what their wishes and views are. That may be in the case we were looking at, it may be that somebody was at the time in A&E receiving treatment. It may also have been in other areas where adult social care may not have easy access. And so what we did agree as a group was that any person at that time could be asking what their views are at the time around their safeguarding referral. Next slide, please. So yeah, that's what I was saying. So that any person who's working or in contact with that person, if they were aware that there was a safeguarding referral, that we were hearing the views of the wishes of the person at the time, it is not the responsibility solely of the adult social care worker. So what we're looking to do as part of the audit is to promote that, and that's why I'm very grateful that I've been able to come here to sort of highlight that to everyone. And what we're saying is that it's then about how that agency then relays that views to the adult social care worker who's considering the thresholds decision-making process in terms of what we then do going forward in safeguarding. So that was short and sweet, and obviously, happy to take questions as we go forward. Thank you, Helen.
Thanks, Griff. That's a really important message, that we keep the person right at the centre of everything that that we are doing. It's important to really understand that person's not only their wishes and feelings, but their lived experience, and that's is vital. And we hear that in our work with children and young people as well. Thank you. So moving on, our next slide. Aha, this is where I'm going to attempt to use a poll. So, hope I've got this right, Liz. So I'm going to go to polls. you set this up yesterday, and I'm going to launch this poll, and hopefully, is it coming up in the chat?
Fine.
Is it coming up?
Yes.
It's all right.
Yes, it's come
Yeah.
up.
Hey, so have you heard of the term cuckooing? And you need to answer either yes or no.
Can you see the results, or do you want us to read them out?
No,
So
I can see the results. Oh,
Brilliant.
that's good. Yeah, 85%, 84%. Oh, just wanted to just mention now that we've got 377 people in the meeting. Isn't that fantastic?
Amazing.
Amazing. Yeah.
Some people are saying yes in the chat as well, so probably not
Oh,
got the poll, but
great.
they're agreeing. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Right. I'm just going to close that. Okay. So cuckooing. So I've got
Every
another.
Tuesday, Case
Oh, hello.
are doing one-to-ones.
Yeah, somebody mute themselves because we're hearing about their one-to-ones. Okay, the next question is and close that poll and go back to, you see, this is next question. Okay, launch. So this is a word cloud thing. Okay, so what do you think it is? So just odd words or phrases, if you could give us some idea of what you actually think it is. Yeah. Some befriending, hijacking, manipulation. Oh, it's fantastic. Yeah. Gosh, exploitation's the biggie. Yeah. Yeah. Drugs, criminal, taking over somebody's house. Often homes of vulnerable people. Yeah, it could be 154 responses here. Oh, this is great. Oh, I'm liking this. Yeah. Yeah, the word vulnerable is coming up an awful lot. Vulnerable person. Yeah. That's great. Thank you. Right, so moving on. Yeah. So this is like I wanted to highlight the guidance that we have in the Safeguarding Adults procedures, guidance for working with adults at risk of exploitation and cuckooing. And the reason I'm reminding people about this, twofold really, is that again, it came out of an audit that people didn't realise that we actually had a cuckooing process, cuckooing guidance, and we have meetings, multi-agency planning meetings to look at this area of risk. So this is a reminder that we have them, but also for those people that work with children and young people, you might also want to look at our guidance as well, because it is quite detailed and quite helpful. And as people have said, so cuckooing is a practice where people take over a person's home and use the property to facilitate exploitation, and it takes the name from cuckoos who take over the nests of other people. Gosh. Yeah, well, it does take over the nests of other people, but I mean the nests of other birds. Okay, yay. So, and it's good examples there which people have mentioned in the word cloud, which is up and around drugs and stolen property, using property for sex work, storing weapons, taking over the property as a place for them to live, and again, taking over the property to financially abuse the tenant. And from a Safeguarding Adults point of view, we know that there are people who have been exploited in this way, are very vulnerable to exploitation, think that they're getting some new friends, and the friends turn out to be, you know, bad friends. And we know nationally there have been cases where it's had tragic consequences. I think it's also fair to say that sometimes the people that are doing the cuckooing are also very vulnerable themselves, and that we see perhaps young people who are involved in this type of behaviour, maybe involved in the county lines behaviour, and have issues of their own. So it's really important that when we suspect cuckooing and there are children and young people involved, that we liaise with between adults and children's services. So that's a reminder about cuckooing. The next thing I want to touch on is multi-agency meetings. And it's interesting, just in this this morning's session, we have heard about one multi-agency meeting, which is the Channel panel. I just mentioned a multi-agency meeting to look at cuckooing. So people attend an awful lot of multi-agency meetings. And one of the things that again has come out of reviews and audits is about people's understanding around multi-agency meetings. What is the purpose of the multi-agency meeting? What are we in the right multi-agency meeting? Is this the right multi-agency meeting to be attending? And I think that's, you know, it's really important that as practitioners and as managers, we're really clear about what the meetings are about, why they're being held, and what the expectations are of people coming to the meeting, organising the meeting, or coming to the meeting. So my next slide, again, we have a guide in the Safeguarding Adults procedures as a guide to multi-agency meetings, and this is when responding to risk and harm to adults. So the meetings that we're talking about, both in the children's sector and the adult sector, are those meetings where we are meeting to discuss risk, harm and risk. And within the children's procedures, you will find that there are standards to be met in attendance at particular meetings, particularly those where, you know, the child protection meetings, strategy meetings, conference, etc. So, but all multi-agency meetings should include an agreed understanding of information sharing, so people know how and why we're sharing information. They should include a risk assessment, defensible decision making, and so on. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but I do think that important things are a clarity of purpose, making sure also that people know what to expect at a meeting, what to bring to a meeting, and that they don't leave a meeting without knowing what the next steps are. And, you know, the timescales, any contingencies. So it's really important. And I think this is particularly important where you have a situation where it's a complex issue, where there are multiple agencies involved, and from an adult perspective, where perhaps you've got fluctuating capacity of the person concerned and engagement. So it's making sure you're at the right meeting and you're prepared. So my other little poll here was to ask you to think about what are the best things about a multi-agency meeting. So if you could just perhaps think of the best things that come out of multi-agency meetings. Yeah, we've got sharing information, shared responsibility, better communication, collaboration. Yeah, collaboration and support, absolutely. I think that's particularly where you have situations that are quite volatile, the dynamics and fluctuating, and sometimes, you know, we're getting somewhere, sometimes we're not. But it is really important. I would also say, and I should have said this right at the start, and it links to Griff's point about making safeguarding personal. Wherever possible, we should have if not the person concerned present, their views are expressed, so we know what you know, what the child, the young person or the adult wants to happen, what their best hopes would be, and sharing that.
This is Pratima, and I support the Children's Policy and Procedures Group for Safeguarding. And I agree with Helen and Liz that there isn't a guide like this, but the things that Helen has put up and talked about apply to all children's multi-agency meetings that safeguard children.
There is guidance in both the children's and the adults' procedures about domestic abuse. But we wanted to point out that domestic abuse now is between individuals is age 16 and over. So, you know, a lot of the time we talk about children, you know, child protection, adult protection over 18. But it's a reminder that children from the age of 16 can be designated as victims of and involved in domestic abuse. And it's a message really to both adult and children's sector workers to remember that if domestic abuse is occurring, then we need to name it. We need to say that this is a domestic abuse type situation. And if you look at the domestic abuse guidance for both children and adults, it does go into a lot of detail about what we mean by domestic abuse and the different types of activity that can go on, the signs, the indicators, and particularly those dynamics in relationships where coercive and controlling behaviour is present. You know, and also that domestic abuse happens to older people. It isn't about young couples. It is older people experience domestic abuse and coercive and controlling behaviour, and we have seen that in reviews that we've undertaken, whether it be safeguarding adult reviews or domestic homicide reviews. It is there, that coercion and the control, and I'm sure colleagues within the children's sector will also see that in relationships between young people. There is coercion and there is control, and we need to name it, and we need to say this is the dynamic, and it should be recorded in case notes and in assessments, and where possible, if the system allows, then, you know, your categories of abuse, then, you know, name it. It is domestic abuse. But just to make sure that it's there, it's in the notes and described as it is. Okay. Escalation of concerns. Again, a reminder that there are times when we are working closely with each other, collaborative way, but sometimes, you know, things don't work so well. Communication does break down between agencies. Perhaps there's concern that people are not being taken seriously, or they haven't, or there's disagreement about the levels of risk. And if that is the situation, then please, you know, follow the procedures, print off the flow chart so you know where to go and what to do if disagreements are there. as it says, at no time must professional dissent detract from ensuring that a child is safeguarded, and I would also say an adult is safeguarded. Their welfare must be paramount throughout. And as it said, disagreements can arise in a number of areas of multi-agency working, and it might be that, you know, and we hear it, you know, this, someone will say, well, I'm sure this is safeguarding, I'm sure it is, and you're saying it isn't, you know, and that's discussion about thresholds. Make sure that you have seen, have looked at the thresholds documents on the procedures website for both children and adults. Disagreements about outcomes of assessments, decision making, roles and responsibilities, who's doing what, oh, I thought they were doing this, that's not my responsibility, etc., etc. Concerns about service provision, look, you know, we've identified a need, there isn't, you know, we don't have a service, its service is stretched. Issues around information sharing and communication, what can we share, what can't we share, you know, it's so important that we understand that. So again, reminding yourselves of what the escalation procedures are saying, and if you're a visual person, very much like I'm a very visual person, and you know, I love a flow chart, so print off a flow chart and save it on your desktop, pin it on the wall, pin it on your you know, wherever, pin it somewhere so you can see it.
Hi everyone, so I'm Susie Armitage. I have the rather delightful title of Designated Doctor for Child Death for Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland, and I work alongside the Child Death Overview panel. Our remit is to review the death of every child up to the age of 18 years who is or has been resident in Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland, to try and understand why they died, what we can learn from it to prevent future child deaths. And there is a significant amount of learning that comes out of our Child Death Overview panel reviews, but also from safeguarding reviews around safer sleeping for babies. So when we look at our data for Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland, looking over 5 years, we have an average of sadly 3 babies a year who die suddenly and unexpectedly, and we're unable to find an explanation as to why they died. But in 2 out of those 3 cases, on average, the baby will have been sleeping in what we know to be an unsafe sleep environment. So it's a recommendation that's come out of our annual report, as well as some of the learning from case reviews that are ongoing, to look at how we can tackle this. We know that the rate of SIDS, of unexplained infant deaths, particularly during sleep, has come down markedly in the last 30 years. But in those babies from more vulnerable homes, in those babies from more deprived backgrounds as well, the rates have not come down as much. So we wanted to put together a tool to help practitioners working with families, and this is something we're putting together. So this is a bit of a trailer, really. This is going to be ready to launch hopefully in September time. So watch this space. We will be back to present more about it. But we're developing a tool for any practitioner working with a family where there is a young baby to use, to help support them to have conversations with families, to give families information, help families to plan ahead and to make choices, to pick up on any particular vulnerabilities there are for that family and help support those, to try and help families have a safer sleeping environment for their babies. So yes, like I say, it's coming. We've got involvement from lots of different agencies in developing this. We've also already had some feedback and input from parents as well. So yes, we'll be back later on this year, hopefully, to present this in full.
Thank you. That's great. Heidi.
Yes, that's me. Yeah, I'm here. Okay, so this is just a little reminder, really. We did have a look on the policies and procedure to see how many people are registered, and actually there's not that many people registered for updates that will automatically come through to your email. So by registering on the multi-agency policies and procedure website, you will automatically be sent updates of any changes to policies or procedures. So keeping you right smack bang up to date really with what's happening and having the most recent information. And it's really what happened was there were some changes on the multi-agency policies and procedures in adults, and that then there were people who were registered, and then that wiped, when the updates happened, it did wipe registration. So what we are asking is for you to, if you think you're registered, please just register again, and the same for children. So when you receive the slides, you're going to receive this slide which has got the links on them for registering for the update. So you can register for adult updates and also register on the children, and it literally takes a few seconds to do. I've done it myself. You know, you click on the link, it takes you to the website. Helen's taking you there. You fill in a couple of details and press submit, and then you will be registered for updates. It's really, really good for whoever the regulating body is. So it's good evidence for the CQC, for Ofsted, you know, to say that you are registered and that you're getting those regular updates. So again, just a little plug, a little bit of a prompt there for you to do that, and the links to make it a bit easier. That's it from me. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you.
Okay, I shall introduce myself. I'm Claire Leyland and I'm a team manager from Barnardos, and I work on the trauma informed practice team, and I've worked across West Midlands and into Leicestershire recently in the last year. So we've been working on delivering training out to all services, all agencies over the last year, and I think prior to that, before I came into place, it was going for longer as well. That's not me that's done that bit. Okay. So I'm going to just do a real whistle-stop tour of what trauma-informed practice is, because normally it would take me 3 days to talk it all through. So we've got 45 minutes and I'm going to do what I can in that time. Basically, we're going to start looking at the 4 R's. So if you've ever heard of trauma-informed practice before, you might have heard of SAMHSA, and they are the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration in America. And they came up with this trauma-informed care in about 2014. And from that, we've built on knowledge. But I think it's always really useful to start with their 4 R's, because we start to think about what is trauma, how do we realise what it is, can we recognise it, can we respond to it, and can we resist re-traumatisation in all that we do, so absolutely do no harm. And I think if we start with those 4 broad concepts as we go through, you'll see how they all fit together. And SAMHSA really is kind of the big player in the world around trauma-informed practice, and everything that has come after that time has really been developed by and built on these original concepts. So I kind of want to introduce those first, and I'm going to go through the training, kind of looking at what are those things and how can we build them into our practice today. Because we're talking about trauma, I feel it's really important to just acknowledge that everyone potentially has had some kind of trauma in their life or some adversity. So I want to firstly say, although there should be nothing particularly triggering in today's training, we never know how someone's going to feel around trauma. So it's important that I give you some kind of dysregulation techniques. So to get yourself back to being regulated, what can we do? So I put 2 up on the screen, and they're the kind of the easiest ones. The 5-finger breathing technique, which I think is fairly self-explanatory, but also the butterfly hug, which is a bit of a favourite of mine, that when I start to feel my heart racing, or I start to feel a little bit uncomfortable, I might start to do that. So I want to give you guys the opportunity to know about those, to have a think about those. But equally, if there's anything that comes up today, please get in touch with me afterwards. And equally, I am online, so it's really hard for me to, you know, you're all blank little dots at the moment, so I can't see how you're doing. So if you do need to step away, please step away from the screen and, you know, look after yourself, take it upon yourself to do that. I'm not going to force you to sit and listen to what I've got to say if it's really not for you. So yeah, just kind of wanted to put that there. We do it every training that we do, and I feel it was important to re-establish that today on this briefing. So as I said, I'm going to start going through the 4 R's of trauma-informed practice. So we're going to realise, so how do we know what's going on? How do we know what trauma is? It's really key that we think about the adversity that we might have gone through and the stress and how we can recover from that. So there we go. I've got a definition of trauma, and actually there are loads and loads of definitions of trauma. And I've put one there on the screen, and that's from the UK Trauma Council. But recently in November 2022, the UK government, well, the English government actually, brought out their own working definition of what trauma is and what trauma-informed practice is. So the one on the screen is the Trauma Council, but I'm going to read to you the one from the government. And they say trauma results from an event, series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as harmful or life-threatening. While unique to the individual, generally the experience of trauma can cause lasting adverse effects, limiting the ability to function and achieve mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. You know, there are many different types of trauma that you might have heard of. We tend to talk about it in the form of being acute trauma, so that might be a single incident of trauma. Chronic trauma, so that might be repeated or prolonged. Something maybe like domestic abuse, we might put in that chronic, it goes on for a long time. And then there's also complex trauma, which is really varied and can involve multiple traumatic events, quite often interpersonal in nature. And you might have also heard of things like organisational trauma, relational trauma, intergenerational trauma. It kind of goes on, and it really builds a picture, but I haven't got time to cover all of that today. So really, I just want to focus on what we might see as trauma and what happens to us and our bodies when something traumatic might happen to us. I feel like I've lost my clicky bit. Oh, it has clicked over. Gabor Mate is someone that talks a lot about trauma, and he has real lived experience. And if you've explored this area before, then you've probably heard of Gabor Mate. And he says trauma is not what happens to us, it's what happens inside of us as a result of what happened to us. And then he goes on to say it's not always caused by the bad things that shouldn't happen. It can be experienced when the good stuff that should happen doesn't happen. So what does he mean by that? He's talking there about the good stuff being attachments. So if in our first 1001 days after birth we're kind of not getting what we need, then that is just as traumatic as any event that could potentially occur to us. Trauma really does change how we perceive others and the world around us and even ourselves, and it changes the brain. And I think that's the important bit that I want you to take away from today, the changes in the brain that go on to have effects later on in life. It really disrupts our capacity to plan and think in some ways, and it really strengthens neural pathways that are there for survival. It works on our survival instincts. And it's important that we realise the implications of trauma on a child's ability to cope with stress. And don't forget that those children go into adults, if they have had trauma in their childhood and it hasn't been processed and dealt with, then they're going to still probably be responding very emotively in difficult situations, because they'll be working in the little bit in the back of their brain that is their survival response. And another person worth noting here is Bessel van der Kolk. He explains that after trauma, the world is experienced with a different nervous system. So every new encounter or event is kind of contaminated by the past. I don't want this to be a really negative view, because actually lots of people that have had trauma or adversity in the past have gone on to do absolutely fantastic things. So, you know, these are possibles, maybes. It's not necessarily going to happen to everyone in the same way. But yeah, I want that to kind of be really clear as we go through the training. I'd say the training, it's a briefing today, but so I also want to introduce the 3 E's, again from SAMHSA. The 3 E's of trauma are around the event, the experience, and the effect. Now, I think it's important to note that what is traumatic for one person is not necessarily traumatic for another. And I think throughout the work that I've done over my working life, really, I've noticed that mostly when I've worked with families with multiple children, they've all been through a very similar experience, but they've all experienced it very differently. And I think that's an important takeaway, that your trauma will be different to somebody else's trauma, and no trauma is better than another or trumps another. It's not like that. It's how our body copes with what's gone on for us. So on the slide in front of you, you can see sort of some of the things we might consider when we say the event. So it might be your lived experience and the circumstances of that event. It might be that it's happened one time or it happens repeatedly over time, but ultimately what it does do is create a high level of toxic stress, and that in itself causes trauma within us, a bit like Gabor Mate said a moment before. The experience is each person may experience that completely differently, as I just said, and that lived experience, how we put a label on what's happened to us, how we put a meaning to what's happened to us, will therefore be our experience of it. And there are ways that we can shift how people think about their lived experiences through therapy, but trauma-informed practice is not really about that. As we get towards the end of the presentation, we'll see that we can be therapeutic in the way that we work with people without being therapists, but we must know our boundaries. And sometimes when we want to talk about trauma and we understand that someone has had trauma, we kind of start to unpick something we maybe not qualified to sort out with them. So it's about being careful and going with it, holding trauma in mind. And the bit I said right at the start about avoiding re-traumatization and doing no harm, it is quite easy to do harm when you think that you're trying to do good stuff. So I want people to be mindful when they do start talking about trauma with people, that their experience of it could be very different to how we might think they might have experienced it as well. And then it moves on to the effects. So what are the effects of the lived experience or the circumstances that might have been traumatic? What's been left behind in our body? Sometimes it's difficult to see the connection between the event and the effect. Sometimes it might have a delayed onset. Trauma doesn't just arrive the day that something terrible happens to somebody. It can take years to come out. And when we think about our veterans and PTSD, you know, it's that moment in which they're transported back to a really difficult point in their life, and understanding the effects then are really as if it's happening right now again. So it's not always easy to spot. We might think, well, why are they behaving like that? Well, actually, underneath all of that was something that happened 20 years ago. So to be just really cautious and mindful that those effects aren't always instant. Okay. So recognise, how do we recognise the signs and the symptoms? I would really love to spend a load of time talking about that, but limited time. So I'm going to try and keep it short. But ultimately, how are we going to start to see the signs and symptoms of trauma? And in there it says in staff, families, clients and others involved in the system. And for me, the first part of that, staff, is really important, because there is a really great Rachel Remen quote, and she says, the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss on a daily basis and not be touched by it is about as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. And I think that sums it up. When we are working with families or adults or children, and they are sharing these really difficult times in their lives, because we're generally working with people who are in crisis, something has happened that's led us to be there. There's no way we can walk away and it not affect us in some way. So if we don't look after ourselves through supervision, through reflections, through getting some exercise and connecting with friends and family, then we will start to potentially kind of head towards burnout or vicarious trauma. And so it's really important for me that we look after our workforce, because if we don't look after the workforce, we can't look after the people that we're trying to support. So that first person there in that sentence is key, the staff. We need to make sure that we're checking in with each other, and there's lots of ways that we can do that. So I'm going to have a quick move on to a slide around, if you've done our training, you will have seen this bear before, so I apologise, but I wanted to bring in our bear because it's a way of talking about how our brain and our body starts to react under threat. So I'm using a bear because generally people haven't had a traumatic incident with a bear. If we were in Canada, I might change this to be a completely different slide. But so I want you to imagine that you're walking through the park and a bear comes and just happens to kind of roar in your face. I want you to think what's happening inside your body at that point. You're likely to have a traumatic stress response. So when we're under threat, our brain will immediately start working in its most primitive place, which is here at the bottom on the brain, in this brainstem area here. So the automatic responses happen here. So you might have heard of the autonomic nervous system, and that's when that kicks in. And our muscles might get tense, we might start to sweat, our heart rate might get higher, we might breathe faster. Lots of things will be going on in our body, and it's our body's way of trying to work out the best way to keep us safe. So this is when our Fs happen, and we talk about the 5 Fs, but actually in reality there are more than 5 Fs, and some people don't get any of these responses. So again, you know, we're going to take it in the broadest sense here. So many of you will have heard of these Fs and what's going on here. So it's happened here in our brainstem, something scary has happened to us and our body is going to respond. It's not going to use our prefrontal cortex where we do thinking. It might connect here with the amygdala in the limbic system where our emotions are, but generally it's going to sit here in the brainstem. Instant response is going to happen to us. So fight, you might want to fight this bear, you know, you might want to have a go, like I've got it, I can stop this bear, I'm going to punch him on the nose and he's not going to come at me anymore. Or we might flight, so we might run away or do all we can to escape the bear. We also might freeze, so just stand there and, you know, I'm going to say trigger warning here and take care, but in situations such as rape, we quite often hear the victim say, I couldn't move, I couldn't make a noise, I couldn't do anything like that. And that could well have been the freeze response. And then we also have the flop response, which is when literal catatonic kind of collapse of the body, where your body just gives up. It just goes into its most like habitual kind of space, lying down and just not being able to move. Your whole body is just focusing on your breathing at that point. That's all it can do. The one that I've skipped over there is fawn. It's also known as a friend response. And I think for a lot of people, you've just talked about cuckooing earlier, and that made me think about this response. When I did some work with the police, they identified this, the fawn and the friend response, as being something they see in cuckooing. So the friend response is when you have maybe met this bear before or know about this bear, and what we need to do to protect ourselves is to befriend that bear or be kind to that bear or do something to that bear, because actually that bear might keep us safe over other things in our lives, even though it might potentially still hurt us. So if you think about the cuckooing scenario where you have, let's say, an older person living in a property and these people have come in and are pretending to be friends with that person to manipulate and coerce. What we will see there is that the person will still be scared. They will maybe know that this isn't okay and that they're being coerced, but their way of staying safe is to befriend them and to protect them. And the police shared with me about how that when they were in that situation, it was very difficult to gain evidence, because that person was saying, oh no, I want them here, this is what I want to do, you know, I'm happy with this is how things are. So that can kind of add into that cuckooing that's going on, this response that we have learnt over time. And sometimes we've learnt that from a very young age. Let's say a child who's experienced abuse might have learnt that from learning that their caregiver, when they're angry, then bad things are going to happen, so that they know they need to keep that parent happy by doing fun things and nice things and doing stuff for that parent, and that is then preemptively preventing themselves from being hurt. So it can be that learned response to prevent yourself from being hurt. I hope that makes sense. But what's going on in our brain essentially is that we're working in our brainstem. Okay, so what can trauma look like? Now, I've got a list here. It is definitely not an exhaustive list. It's just a few things that have come up regularly in our trainings that I've put together. So I've put there behaviour is communication, because ultimately, whenever we see any kind of behaviour that is going on, we need to start asking the question of what's underneath that, what's going on for that person. Why are they behaving in this way? Why are they communicating in this way? Because behaviour is ultimately a communication. So you might see someone who's quick to anger, with poor self-esteem, feelings of guilt and shame, impulsive, withdrawn, hypervigilant, prone to outbursts, distrusting, difficulty controlling emotions, unable to concentrate, might be anxious, they might be feeling persecuted. Oh, I've gone too far, sorry. Ultimately, you could apply that list to so many other things as well. So when we talk about trauma-informed practice, we're just asking you to hold that in mind as one possibility. It's not always going to be trauma that is causing some of these behaviours. We might notice that some maybe behavioural difficulties in school aren't because of this, it's because of a learning difficulty, you know, but we need to be starting to ask that question of what's going on, what's behind this behaviour, what do we understand? But also what's missing there is that people-pleasing behaviour that I talked about just, and sort of no eye contact is quite common, but then no eye contact is quite common if you have someone who's on the autistic spectrum disorder, let's say, you know, it's not, this list could be applied to so many things is what I'm trying to say in amongst that. Okay, so moving us on, I want to talk a little bit about this window of tolerance. Some of you may have heard of this before. Now, this is a metaphorical window. So this, we suggest that everyone essentially has a window of tolerance, and that we can live quite happily in that middle band, in this band here. Lots of people live here. So that's not to say that nothing bad ever happens or you don't have highs and lows, but what it's saying is you can kind of maintain yourself within that window of tolerance, that little bit there. For some people, their window of tolerance will be much, much narrower than someone else. So if we talk about someone who may have suffered some trauma, their window of tolerance is likely to be smaller. So what we will see is behaviour that means that they're going to pop out of their window of tolerance. And the ways that we will spot this might be behaviourally, so might go into their hyperarousal stages where they are maybe out of control, they are angry, they are hypervigilant. But equally, they might pop down lower out of their window of tolerance, where we see that they are maybe exhausted or disassociated, really zoned out, and that will be their hypoarousal state. So with somebody who's suffered trauma, that you will see more often. So you might see that more often in people that you're working with. You might see that they are spiking in and out of here. Just like, you know, that threat of the bear in the woods, someone may well be out of their window of tolerance because they've been triggered by something. I'm not going to talk about triggers today, but triggers are those things that take us back. Like there's a wormhole of pain, it takes us back to something that happened in the past, triggered by something that's happened right this second. You know, it could be a perfume, it could be a smell, it could be a sound, it could be anything. But ultimately, we pop out of our window of tolerance when we're feeling unsafe, and potentially when we're feeling powerless, or we might be lacking connection to others, because all of those things help build our window of tolerance be a little bit bigger. So resilience is a key word that's used all the time. And what is it? Ultimately, resilience will be built when you have those things that I've just said, when you have an adult or someone to talk to that you feel that you can trust, and that you have a community that might support you, or that you have rules and boundaries and safe spaces to be. Those things will help build resilience. But ultimately, when we pop out of our window, we might say that we're feeling dysregulated or not in control of our emotions or feelings. I have got a video by Dan Siegel, and I think it's really useful because it's, again, a really good one to use with people. The best thing that we can do if someone has suffered from trauma is to teach them about what's going on in their brain. So we can take away the shame, because with trauma quite often comes a whole lot of shame. And if they're understanding that actually their behaviour is normal for someone that has been through what they have been through, then this is normal behaviour. And it's about how can we start to regulate ourselves. But I'm going to show you this video by Dan Siegel, and he will talk that through.
One of the most rewarding experiences for me has been to study brain science and apply it to the experience of parenting. And the hand model of the brain that I use to teach parents is very useful to understand that. So if you take your thumb and put it in the middle of your palm, put your fingers over the top, this is a very useful model of the brain. And when we can actually see in front of us what's going on in the brain, then we can change what the brain does. So let me walk you through very basically what happens in this brain and the structures in it. And it goes like this. The spinal cord comes up representing the wrist, and then you have coming up into the skull, the brain stem and the limbic area, which work together to help regulate arousal and your emotions and the way you have a fight, flight, freeze response. These are below the cortex, the limbic and brainstem areas, and the cortex is this higher part of the brain that allows us to perceive the outside world, to think and reason. And this frontmost part of the brain, right behind your forehead, so the person's oriented like this, is actually the part that regulates the subcortical, limbic, and brainstem areas. This regulation is very important because sometimes we can have all sorts of things happen in our life. We're tired, we're exhausted, someone pushes a particular emotional button, and we can flip our lids. So rather than being tuned in and connected and balanced and flexible, we can lose all of that flexibility, even lose moral reasoning, and act in ways that are terrifying to others, including our children. Now, you can actually bring yourself back online and come back to the high road and make a repair with your child, and that's important to explain to them. And you can also use this hand model of the brain to explain to children, even as young as 5 and 6, how to understand when their emotions are rising up from the brainstem and limbic areas here, and how it's overriding the prefrontal area and making it so they may be about to flip their lids. So I've had kids come tell me that they're about to go flip their lids and they need a break. They need a timeout. And by even just naming that, they can tame it. And that's the power of using the hand model for ourselves and our children to help us all make sense of what goes on in the emotional communication that we have in the course of day-to-day life.
I find that video really useful, and I know when I've delivered it on training and when I've shared it with other organisations and again with the police, they found that a useful tool because they can think about the person that's presenting with them. Where are they? Are they in their window of tolerance? Are they about to flip their lid? What is it that we need to do to support them to get them to be regulated again? So just to talk through what's going on in the brain. So we talked about that brainstem and what happens there, and the cerebellum area here. What happens up here in the prefrontal cortex is most of the reasoning and the rationalizing, and that's not really developed fully until sort of mid-20s. Now it's different for everyone, so I won't want to give a figure on the 25th birthday, then your brain will be fully functioning and fully working. But ultimately, it can help us think about teenagers a little bit more. They're working a lot in the limbic system, a lot in the emotional area of their brains, whereas a lot of the reasoning and rationalizing goes on up here in the prefrontal cortex. But how can we help someone when they are feeling dysregulated? So when they're working in the brainstem and in this region here in the limbic system, we can use something called regulate, relate and reason. And that's about noticing, what do they need when they are in their brainstem stage, when they're in their fight or flight, what is it that they need? They need to be able to regulate. For some people, they've never been taught how to do this. It's not something you just suddenly know how to do. You might have been taught it by your parents. When you're upset, they will cuddle you and soothe you. If you haven't had that, then regulating becomes quite difficult. And if you've suffered from some trauma, again, regulating, because you're living a lot of your life in this section of your brain, regulating is not going to be something that you're able to do unsupported. So we talk about co-regulation, and that is when someone else helps you. So That's easy to do when it's a child we're talking about. So the phrase connection before correction, we need to making sure that we can connect with them, that we can calm them by talking to them calmly, by sharing soothing sounds and kind of being with them, not necessarily holding them. For some children, that's very difficult. It gets a bit harder as adults grow up and still haven't learned how to regulate, because they're not going to appreciate you trying to hush them or make rhythmic sounds with them. They're going to kind of look at you and say, what are you doing? But actually explaining what's going on in their brain. Oh, I can see right now that you're not feeling so good. What about a glass of water? What about counting 3 blue things in this room? Thinking about little de-escalation strategies that will take them out of that fear sensor of their brain, then those things can kind of help. So hopefully that's given you a bit of a highlight around what is going on in the brain. As I said, co-regulating is really important. If we can do that with someone, if we can teach them how to get themselves calm again, and that will be different for everybody. And then we can lead ourselves into this space, thinking that every little interaction that we have is a potential intervention. And that's something Karen Treisman says. And she, again, another real thinker in the trauma-informed space. If you haven't read her stuff or seen her stuff, then I would recommend you go away and have a look at it. At the end of the presentation, there is a list of resources that I kind of suggest that everyone should have a little look at. But yeah, sometimes it's the little things that we do that are really important. And I think about my old job and how, just from that first phone call with speaking to a family that I'm about to work with, I can set a tone. And if that phone call is a friendly, kind space, they're more likely to want to engage with me. If that first meeting is about me kind of being honest and open and transparent and offering them a space to just freely talk, I might get a better response. So we start to think about what is trauma-informed practice, and it's those little things. Every little interaction we have with somebody, we need to keep in the back of our mind, how are they coping with this? I don't know their history. Have they had trauma? Is there other things going on here? Holding that in mind will mean that I respond to them in a way that builds trust and safety, belonging, connectedness, all of those words. And at the start of the presentation, I said it's not just kindness and compassion and empathy, and it's not, it's so much more. And I think sometimes people feel, oh, that's what trauma-informed practice is, a bit of compassion and empathy. Actually, if we just say that, we miss out on all of the amazing things that we can do to be part of someone's journey in exploring their trauma or feeling safe in that space when they have had trauma. So respond. How are we going to respond? So we need to understand the brain. So we've just done that. We need to understand what trauma is. We've done that. And now we need to think about how we're going to apply that to what we do and our policies and our procedures. Sometimes we, as practitioners on the ground, can't necessarily change policies and procedures, but we can all do our little bit. Trauma-informed practice is really the golden thread that goes through everything that we do. And it doesn't matter at what role you're doing, you're important too. And that goes from the cleaner to the secretary to the administrators to the security guards. Anyone that works in an organisation needs to understand trauma, because they are going to be the first point of contact for a lot of the people that we work with. So what is trauma-informed practice? I've popped on there. It's a strengths-based approach. It's rooted in healthy reciprocal relationships, and I can't kind of say that enough. The relationships that we create with the people that we work with will be the kind of bit that we can help with change. If we've got a good relationship, someone is going to want to believe and work with us. So that will help change ultimately. Promotes a culture of safety, empowerment, and collaboration. We need people to feel safe in the space that we're providing, whether that's physical or emotional. We need people to feel they have power and control over their lives. A lot of people, when there has been trauma in the past, that's the bit that's been missing, that power, that collaboration, that empowerment. So don't do anything to us without us would be a phrase that I would say. You know, it's important that we take people on the journey. We can't have that journey without them. So they are key areas. In the little purple box, you might not be able to read it because it's quite small. It says best practice requires a whole organisational approach in which practice is infused into every element of an organisation. And again, I would say that wholeheartedly. We don't like to deliver a training and just say, there's a training, off you go, because we know training is only one part of that. We need to look at the much bigger system in which we're working to make sure that we are making all of the changes that are needed to for somebody who has maybe had some trauma to access our services. And we'll talk a bit in a second about language, because that's a really important bit of that. And then at the bottom there, it's those 4 R's, the ones that we're going through right now. So SAMHSA again, they have 6 principles of trauma-informed practice and organisations approach that uses these 6 words basically. Safety, empowerment, choice, trust and collaboration and context. So we can't do any of those things without understanding the context in which it's in. For safety, you know, how do we make our interactions with people as safe as possible? Have we considered everything? Have we thought about them and how it might be perceived and how we come across? Are we meeting them in a place that is safe for them to be? Sometimes the buildings that we work in, when we invite people in to work with us, actually it doesn't feel like a safe space for them. And I certainly know working in schools, when you invite parents into a school, they might have had really poor experiences themselves at school, and actually coming in to speak to the head teacher and sit in the head teacher's office might create a real reaction. So when you've got that parent in front of you, if you're that head teacher, you might think, wow, they're really prickly, they're not interested. Actually they are, they're there, but all of their fear, their stress response is kicking in, and they can't contain themselves in that space. So thinking about how can we create safety. Trust, you know, again, that connection before correction. It's important that we gain trust from those that we work with. How do we do that? Well, that's going to depend on the kind of work that you're doing. But ultimately, if we do what we say we're going to do, and we turn it when we say we're going to do it, and we're honest about what we can and can't do, then we're going to build trust. So those things are important. As I said before, choice is so important. As much choice as we can give someone as possible. Sometimes there's little choice, and that is okay, because if we've had that transparent discussion about it, then people understand, you know, I don't have much choice in this. However, I trust you. I think you're going to help me and support me. So therefore, I will accept that my choices are fairly limited. Collaborating, you know, it's really important to get that voice of the child through every bit of work that we do, and the voice of the person that you're working with. You know, if you're working with adults, their voice is so key. And I think listening earlier when I was typing away, someone had talked about your multi-agency meetings, and actually the voice of that person has to be the loudest one in that room. It needs to be heard the most. For good trauma-informed practice, their voice needs to be loud and clear. What they want in the words that they want it as well. I think there's nothing more disempowering than listening to what someone has said and then retelling it in your own language and your own words. It needs to be their language and their words. Context. So how does all of this fit together? How does it intersect? Have we considered culture, age? Have we thought about what is interplaying here? And so all of these things are ultimately what is trauma-informed practice. All those things together. And trauma-informed practice is not a destination, it is very much a journey, and it's a continuation of implementing new things and trying new things and working out what works and what doesn't work. But again, we're not going to work out what works and doesn't work without collaborating with the people that we work with, and that is really, really important. Okay, let me move us on. So I mentioned before language, and I'm a real stickler for this. If we think about the language that we use, we can change a whole narrative of somebody's life. And when writing case notes and reports about people, the language that we choose to use will be the language that is heard by everyone else who comes after you. So if we use language like, they're attention seeking rather than attachment seeking or attention needing, or that they are withdrawn rather than they're cautious due to their previous experiences, or, you know, they did not attend when actually they just could not attend. It wasn't a safe space for them. They didn't feel like they'd been listened to. They didn't feel validated. You know, if someone's coming across as aggressive, are they aggressive, or are they in their fight or flight bit in the back of their brain and they're feeling frightened? We can change the language really easily, and that's the first and easiest thing that we can start to do when we want to implement trauma-informed practice, is think about the language we're using. I was listening to a podcast being recorded with Lisa Cherry and Dr. Karen Treisman, and in that they were talking very much about the language that's used. And someone had said about, well, what language do we use around the clients that we're working with? So, you know, should they be called clients? And someone said, oh no, I call them service users. And someone had put in the chat, in my organisation, I've heard professionals refer to people as the service losers, and that stuck in my head. And I just think that, again, is the power of language. If you're in an organisation where people are so disrespectful about those who are accessing the services, we have to really take a good look. So language, so important. I choose to use people that we work with. You know, whatever organisation you work in might have a different way. I don't particularly like service user, because like, who wants to use a service? That means they've got a problem. Not everyone wants to feel like that, because when someone's got a problem, there's a whole heap of shame put on that because they've got a problem. You know, again, that language can really change the situation and the way we see it and the person. So I want you to consider language as a thing that you can do straight away. I got sent some of your serious case reviews and safeguarding case reviews, and one of the things that came up in that throughout, I think, as a major kind of something we need to consider more, was professional curiosity, and that's something that we do talk a lot about in trauma-informed practice. And not only the professional curiosity, but not understanding the impact of trauma within that professional curiosity. Someone's put there, it's not something we use in adult social care in Leicester City anymore. Oh, service user, sorry, I was thinking professional curiosity. I was like, oh no, really? Okay, so keeping an open mind and remaining flexible is probably the first thing that we need to do, and everyone knows. Yeah, I will make sure anything that I've mentioned today, I'll make sure I send a link for the podcasts and things like that. I'll send it through to Helen to pass on to everyone. Yeah, so professional curiosity, keeping that open mind and remaining flexible. That sounds like such an easy thing to do, but in reality, we know that it's not, because keeping an open mind means that we have to acknowledge all our own biases, and people can sit and say, I have none, and that isn't true. We all come with our own biases, and we have to acknowledge them, reflect on them, learn from them, develop with them. It's that continual reflecting that's important, but absolutely remaining flexible, kind of not seeing everything there, because we've got this view of what's going on without really being broad enough to have a look at the context. You know, when I think about contextualized safeguarding, we're looking at that much bigger picture, and we need to make sure we do that with absolutely everyone that we work with. So utilising other sources of information, that multi-agency working, it comes up in every case review, doesn't it, that we need to be working better with other agencies, sharing information. So making sure that we're doing that, asking open-ended questions but not probing, and this is really key when it comes to trauma-informed practice, is that we don't go diving into people's trauma when we are not qualified to deal with it. We don't need to know the actual ins and outs of what's gone on in someone's life unless they want to share that. And even if they do want to share that, I would still be mindful of saying, I'm happy for you to talk to me about this, but what I would really like to do is find the right person that can help you sort it through. I think that's fair to do to people, because when we start, if someone feels really comfortable, they will offload it. But actually, if we're then in a place where we can't hold it and we don't know what to do with it next, then that's not good for us either. So being really aware of that. Reflecting on the information, checking out theories. You know, your colleagues are always going to be the best people to check out your theories with. Sometimes if you get the opportunity to do joint visits or meet people in pairs or something, that helps to kind of get a better view on things. Predicting but not presuming or assuming, again, that's a key one. And using your professional judgment and gut instinct. If there's something not sitting right, that's because something's not right. You know, our when we talk about what's going on in our body, the central vagus nerve runs right the way through to our gut. So we feel things there that we can't necessarily understand. That doesn't mean that they're always going to be right, but we do need to check them out and find out.
Absolutely. It is a 6-minute video, but it is probably worth having a look, because it really says everything about the dynamic support pathway and the support that the key worker from Barnardos has to offer. And it says it far better than a slide that I can present, or you know, any words can, because it's coming out, you know, in the words, like sort of the previous speaker was saying, in real words from sort of a real mother, you know, with a real son going through this point of crisis. So it's far better than my words. Right, so the aims were, as we said, a more robust early intervention process, early identification of concerns, and we're here to try and facilitate collaborative joint working, and to develop bespoke action plans that will meet the individual's needs in the community. We're hoping that all stakeholders will be equally committed, and the processes that we put in place will be responsive for children, because as I said, this is a service for both adult and children. For children and young people, the dynamic support pathway is managed by Barnardos. We commissioned Barnardos to deliver the key worker scheme, and from within that scheme they manage the dynamic support pathway. So when you refer, they will set up the sort of meetings for you and allocate a key worker should that be required. So that's all rolled up into one. The long-term benefits we're looking for, I mean, this is sort of, you would be able to write these yourself. We wanted to be person-centred, proactive and preventative. That basically when someone is deteriorating in their well-being in the community for whatever reason, we can identify it early and we can put access in place to the right level of support from health, social care and education to try and put back the well-being and avert the crisis. We don't want to crisis manage, we want to crisis avoid, and that's what we're trying to do. For all the things we mentioned earlier, to keep families together, avoid the untoward incidents, avoid inappropriate admission and readmission. But what we're not saying is we're not trying to avoid an appropriate admission. If there is a clear treatment pathway and a rationale for admission, then we will also try and facilitate that for you. So the register, as I said, is not the pathway in itself. It's just a simple spreadsheet which holds all the confidential information about the individual. It's a tool that's built within the pathway, and sort of sometimes it gets confusing because in the olden days, it used to be called the Dynamic Support Register before we actually built it into a pathway with lots of linked processes built around it. And to be honest, if you call it the Dynamic Support Register or the Dynamic Support Pathway, we will step in to support whatever you call it. But if you're looking for things on the web space, try and remember to look for the Dynamic Support Pathway, because that will take you to the link quicker. A person's consent must be given to go on to the Dynamic Support Register, and there'll be sort of consent forms that you will find in the sort of the support folder. You'll find referral forms, an SOP, guidance notes, how to use it, consent forms, all sorts of different things are built within this folder for you. But the DSR is the central point, I think, because the position of the individual on the Dynamic Support Register will govern and inform the linked processes that will be available. Right, so very briefly, the referral form. It's available on Leicester Partnership Trust Internet website. It's available to all because it's on the internet site. It's going to go as a self-referral pathway very, very soon. We're just waiting for the HIS team to finish the development of the self-referral form and put it on the portal. But it's still there and the original forms can still be used. So it's still a live support pathway, but you'll probably see that sort of come beginning of June, all the guidance notes, everything will be replaced by sort of refreshed, updated ones. All of that we've just mentioned, everything will be available in the same web space. The referral criteria, I'm not going to go through all of this, it's too much to absorb, but all of this is built within the documents that you find available. All of these are attached as appendices in the SOP and the standard operating procedure as well. I think the only thing to say here is this is the amber rating, and if you refer early, before crisis, as soon as you identify deterioration in well-being, for whatever reason, and these examples are listed down here as examples only. I'm quite happy if there is any reason that you identify for deterioration in well-being, then make the referral, pick up the phone, talk to us. So the plan is, or the hope is, that you refer early. We have the meetings, we develop the action plan, everyone delivers to the action plan, and the individual comes onto the pathway as amber and leaves the pathway as amber. If we're not able to alleviate the crisis, then they will be escalated up to red, and a different set of linked processes come into being when someone is escalated, because this is really saying that the individual is in crisis. Maybe what we did earlier wasn't enough, or maybe it was too late. Whatever the reason, we need to step it up, because the risk of something, an admission or a care order, or contact with the criminal justice system, all those things that we want to avoid, is becoming more at risk, and we need to do more. There is a new cohort, but you don't refer in on this cohort. All this is really saying is now is if an individual does get admitted to hospital, previously they used to come off the register, and then they used to have to be referred back onto the register when they came out of hospital, and that was kind of crazy, because people were being asked to sort of redo referral forms, and it was, you know, it was a waste of valuable time. So what happens now if somebody is admitted to hospital is all the data is retained, and they're moved into a different section of the dynamic support register. And all these inpatient linked processes will take place as they normally would. We'll prepare for discharge. Upon discharge, this person's sort of information is reactivated back onto amber, and all the linked processes pick up again, and a post-discharge multi-agency meeting is set up to check that the discharge plan is working, and also really to check that it's sufficient to meet the needs of the individual, because post-discharge is obviously a really vulnerable time for the individual, their family, the carers, and even the providers as well. So, contents of the referral form, I don't intend to go through this either. It's classic information, demographics, commissioner information, brief history, risk details, safeguarding information. That's really key information. The self-referral form is different. We've simplified it to the minimum amount of information necessary. We don't want to cause anxiety for anyone. We appreciate that when somebody's going to self-refer them, an adult or a child, they could be in a state of heightened anxiety. The last thing they need is something difficult. So we will accept minimum input. And if it's in hours, that person will be contacted. If it's out of hours, there will be contact details to sort of get through to help elsewhere. There'll be a lot of support and help given to any self-referral that comes in. We'll obviously need to check that there is a confirmed diagnosis in place. It'll be done sensitively. We need to check that they're in the right area, that they are either receiving health support from within area, they've got a GP registered within the ICB, or if they're receiving social care support from any of the 3 local authorities across sort of LLR, because obviously the boundaries aren't 100% coterminous. And even if they're sort of receiving, you know, healthcare support from Nottinghamshire, if they're receiving social care support from one of LLRs, we will still step in and we'll offer this service. This is, again, it's a brief synopsis of, I think, what we've just done. But really, it's just to say that we expect individuals to move between the cohorts. In an ideal world, come in at amber, go out in amber, but they could go up to red, they could come back down to amber, they could go into blue. They'll move around, and we'll flex all the different sort of link processes and support we will around what they need. Okay, so the link processes, they're just designed to support admission avoidance and to support readmission avoidance post-discharge. The multi-agency meeting, I'm sure many of you will have been to multi-agency meetings in the past. It's a key linked process for Amber. We will just support you to bring to the table everyone that needs to be involved. We will support with the development of an action plan. We'll support with the follow-up of the action plan. We'll support with setup of subsequent multi-agency meetings. But it is important to know that the attendees, that the health and social care professionals, education professionals around the table, they will decide on the action plan. That they will sort of discuss that and agree it together. They will then be asked, do you need another multi-agency meeting? How soon will you need another meeting? Let's put it in our diary now so we don't lose traction of what's going on here. There'll be support to follow up, because feedback that's come into us has said, it's great, we set up a first multi-agency meeting, but then we don't have the right people attend, or the right people do attend and agree to do things, and then for some reason they're not able to deliver them, but we don't know that until the crisis ensues. So all of those things will help you with to make sure we keep track of it all. And if plan A won't work or can't work, then we'll come back together and we'll get a plan B in a timely way. So again, you as a group will decide when they come off the dynamic support pathway. You as a group will also say, hey, this isn't working, we need to escalate to red. We need a CTR and possibly even admission. So all of that is managed by you as the sort of people involved with the individual. Multi-agency meeting, I think we've just talked about that a little bit. The multi-agency meeting notes template. There is a template that has been developed with different sections that now meet all the requirements of the minimum standards, and sort of the sections on all the different key lines of inquiry. I'll very, very quickly go through the key lines of inquiry, because these are the things that are important to know and to be able to offer support around. Post-discharge support plans, if it's applicable, physical health, medication, all aspects of health and social care support, accommodation, education, parent, family and carer involvement. What's the impact on the family and carers at the moment? What support is being given to the family and carers themselves, because it's been found we don't ask enough about that. We know they offer support to the individual, but what are we offering to them? Advocacy involvement. It's really important to sort of think about the aspirations of the individual and the family. There's rights and legal frameworks that we also have to think about. There's a new section for looked after children, because again, this is a new minimum standard for looked after children placed out of area. We are offering this support and sort of early support if there's any reason for sort of concern. We need to check on safety. There's a new section on risk of exploitation as well. And then there's obviously the sections on escalation, next steps, data follow-up. And if you're identifying any gaps in service, we'd like to know about that as well. The care, education and treatment review is very, very similar, but it's more formal, and it's got independent scrutiny from an independent clinical expert, an independent chair, and an independent sort of expert by experience. So it's very, very similar, but more formal, and there will be sort of high level follow-up. And a new process that's been put in place is very senior management scrutiny of the quality of the CTRs. Are we getting the right people there? Do they drive the outcomes that we're needing? So that scrutiny is new and it's going to be put in place. This is a service put in place to support you, not to replace you. We can't replace you. We're not clinicians. We're support to help you to bring the right people to the table and put an action plan together, and then we'll support you in making sure the actions are followed up. And basically, this is our plea. The sooner you talk to us and send the referral in, the quicker we can act. And please don't leave it too late. Please don't leave it until they're in crisis. We appreciate that sometimes crisis happens with very little sort of notice, and that's fine. Make that referral in when they're read, but if you can, talk to us when you're trying to avoid crisis, not in crisis.
Here, you know, when we think back to the horrific stories that we saw in it nationally about, you know, the inappropriateness of placements made for children and adults with learning disability and autism, and how it was so difficult for families and carers to actually have any contact or see the person, and the inappropriateness of those placements, and so little thought had gone into that planning. But also, I think, you know, that colleagues who are in the session now will know that we have been undertaking safeguarding adult reviews in relation to adults with learning disabilities, and really want to you know, highlight the need for vigilance and picking things up around people's health and well-being at an earlier stage. So really do welcome this this initiative, and thank you very much. And
there is
yes.
a question in the chat. Sorry, could I just?
Oh, yes.
Sorry.
I don't know if it was covered because I was writing it down. So, can individuals and families self-refer?
Yes, it's a new minimum standard. I think there was a couple of slides, wasn't it? I'm not sharing anymore. Oh, I am still sharing, aren't I? Am I still sharing?
Yes.
Yes, and there was a slide on self-referral. Yeah, I think
it came after I was writing the question. I do apologise, but just wanted to make sure it was covered.
Yeah.
There it is. Yeah. There is absolutely a new self-referral process, and we've made it as simple as possible. And as soon as we get that referral, we'll be the TCP officer will be incredibly supportive in trying to understand the needs and getting the further information that we need. So yeah, the self-referral form is not up on the website yet. It's still being finalised. Yeah. We're hoping it will be up by the end of this month, because it's a much simplified form.
That explains, because the person's written it says professionals only when you go into the website, so that's why it's coming.
Okay. Yeah, it's coming. You know, sort of, it is absolutely coming. So, and to be honest, that's one of the things that we fear, because we really don't know how many self-referrals we're going to get, and sort of, in fact, we're going to talk about the risk of that and how we're going to manage it at the meeting this afternoon. Because if we get a lot of self-referrals, we need to step up our support that's actually available, and maybe even need to sort of think about additional staff that might come in. But we just don't know. We will know very soon.
Yeah.
And obviously it's a really sensitive subject, because they will be in a heightened state of anxiety when they refer. They could be young, they could be sort of under 18, and there's sort of consent issues, there's parent sort of knowledge issues, there's all sorts of things that we're going to have to sort of learn to manage, and probably come for advice on when some of these things happen.
There's a question. It says, how long does timescale for self-referral take to receive help?
They will get an immediate automated response. If it comes in out of hours, they'll get the emergency contact details to go to if the sort of the TCP officers are not in work. But as soon as they're in work, that comes in. to them. They will see it come across their desk the same day, and they will respond the same day. And then from there, we talk about what we need to put in place. But there'll be contact straight away. There's no sitting in there waiting for a weekly referral management meeting. It's what I'd call, single piece flow. It comes in, it's dealt with straight away. It won't have to wait for a meeting.
Thank you. Okay, well, I'm going to wrap things up now, because people are leaving, and that's fine, because it is lunchtime, and please try and take a break if you can. I know it's difficult these days because people go straight into other meetings, but thank you so much, and thank you for your participation. Thank you to the presenters. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you.